Hello. So in this sociology revision video, I'm going to talk through the sociological explanations of the links between ethnicity and crime. And just to say at the start that there's a lot that I've said in the other videos that you can link to ethnicity in the same way there's a lot that you can link to class and gender as well. So I'm really talking about here the specific things that explain the links between ethnicity and crime. So before we get going with the explanations, we need to think about crime statistics, and I've included this graph here from 2020 of the UK crime statistics. So you can see, for example, the UK black population is 3%. For stop and search, black people make up 18% of that. For arrests, it's 9%, prosecutions 11%, convictions 10%, etc., etc. So we can see that black people are overrepresented in crime statistics. So that really what we're talking about here is why is that? And there's kind of three big explanations as I see it for that from sociologists. So the first one is it because of racism in the criminal justice system and policing? So we'll talk about that first. The second thing we're going to talk about is it to do with deprivation? So this kind of link to class issues, lack of opportunity, marginalization, poverty, basically. And then the final point is it resistance? Okay, obviously these things can work together. It's not saying that it's just one. It's not saying that one is more important than the others. It's just these are the three kind of explanations that have been given. So on to the first explanation: racism in the criminal justice system and within policing. So really here, sociologists have highlighted institutional racism as a concept, and this was actually outlined, and I've got a picture of the first page of the Macpherson report, which was a government report 1999 following the investigation of Stephen Lawrence's murder, which found that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist. Okay, so you can use that as evidence that institutional racism is a thing. It was found in a government report in 1999. Similarly, Waddington, others have written about this, but Waddington in 1999 discussed the concept of canteen culture. So this is the idea that within certain workplaces, and Waddington specifically talking about police, that there becomes a kind of canteen culture where it's kind of like the workplace banter, the workplace discussions, the things that the way that people talk in the workplace. And if we're specifically talking about police, we're talking behind closed doors, police talking about certain groups. And what Waddington argues is this culture develops, and that leads to police doing their job in a different way. So they target certain groups. They're more likely, and if we go back to the last slide, if we look at stop and search, canteen culture could be an explanation for why black people in Britain are overrepresented in stop and search. Okay, so that's Waddington's concept of canteen culture. Hood talks about racism within the criminal justice system, or kind of overrepresentation of black people particularly, and Hood found that black men were 5% more likely to be in prison than white men. And it's like, well, why is that for the same crime? So an explanation that sociologists have given is that it's because of racism, that it's just, people get longer sentences, more likely to be stopped and searched, more likely to be arrested, etc., because of racism. So in terms of evaluation, the first thing before we get into the evaluation is this can be linked to labeling. So you can make that link to Becker and interactionist ideas about labeling if you're talking about institutional racism, canteen culture, those kind of things. But then in terms of evaluation, you could say, well, what about class here? Is it just ethnicity? Is that the reason why certain groups are overrepresented, or is it to do with class as well? And we're going to come on to that in the next slide. Okay, so what about other explanations in terms of higher levels of criminality in minority groups? So this is the idea that actually certain groups do commit more crime, but then it's because of deprivation, it's because of poverty, it's because of marginalization. So the first one to talk about is left realist ideas. So this is Lee and Young and talking about relative deprivation, marginalization, and subculture. So this idea that people who are ethnic minorities are more likely to be deprived, more likely to be marginalized, and therefore more likely to join criminal deviant subcultures, more likely to commit crime, and therefore more likely to be arrested, etc. And that explains the higher crime rate. In the US, there was a study by Nightingale, and I've got the cover of the book there on the edge, which came up with this concept of the paradox of inclusion. And it talked about young black males, particularly in Philadelphia, who kind of bought into the idea of the American dream of wanting the consumer products, wanting the things that are kind of being advertised, but didn't have access to those things because of um, inequality, because of lack of opportunity in education, in the workplace. And so we can see this is quite useful in terms of linking to strain theory. It's very, very similar to strain theory. So what did people do? What did these young black men do in Philadelphia? They turned to crime. And what did they do with the money they made from crime? They bought the things that were being advertised, consumer products. So it's quite similar to the concept of kind of innovators in Merton's strain theory. So Nightingale's concept of the paradox of inclusion is specifically talking about young black men in Philadelphia. Again, it's linking to this idea of kind of poverty and deprivation being the kind of driving force. Also, we've got a study by Pitts in 2008, which says that violent gangs and kind of criminal gangs are a kind of almost like a rational response by those who are marginalized and those who are cut off from mainstream society. So I've said here we can link this to subcultural theory. It's quite similar to kind of Cloud and Olin, the illegitimate opportunity structure, even Cohen's status frustration. So this idea that for ethnic minorities who are marginalized, getting involved in kind of criminality is almost like a rational choice. You can't achieve in the traditional way, so you have to find other ways. Again, it's similar to strain theory. So big evaluation here would come from right realists who would say this is kind of removing personal choice, and they would argue that crime is a rational choice. It's not about people's economic position. Right realists would argue that criminals make a choice, and we shouldn't kind of excuse them. This is kind of excusing them. It's saying, oh, it's about their background. Right realists would be very critical of that. Okay, on to the third and final key point here. So the idea of resistance, and you can obviously link this to the CCCS and neo-Marxist ideas about resistance and kind of youth subcultures. But the main one here is Paul Gilroy and this idea about the myth of black criminality in 1982. And so what Gilroy argues in this work is that for ethnic minorities in Britain, British Asians and African Caribbeans who originate from former colonies, they carry what Gilroy says is the scars of imperialist violence. And so there's a culture of resistance that's kind of there, that's part of the culture of these former colonies, because that was developed in response to racism. And what Gilroy says is that for young minority individuals in the UK presently to deal with the racism in the UK, this culture of resistance kind of comes out. However, at the same time, Gilroy argues that the myth of black criminality actually it's a myth. It's not as there's not as much crime by young black men, for example, as the media tell us, and it's actually fueled by the media, and it has a political agenda. It's basically creating a scapegoat to take the attention away from kind of more significant issues in society, and that's driven also by racism in the police force. So this point could be linked to the earlier point that I talked about, racism in the criminal justice system. In terms of evaluation, this has been criticised by Lee and Young, and basically the criticism, and they are left realists, the main criticism is that this kind of romanticizes criminals, and also the idea that most victims of crime are neighbors of the perpetrators. So they're most likely to be the same ethnic group, the same kind of class position. So that kind of really undermines the idea of this being an act of resistance, that crime is an act of resistance. So they're the main explanations that sociologists have given for the links between ethnicity and crime. I think the other thing to add is, obviously, when we're talking about official statistics, we need to be critical of official statistics. We need to remember where they have come from, and we need to think about things like the criminal iceberg and the dark figure of crime and the crime that isn't reported. Okay, I hope that was useful. Please leave any comments if you've got any questions or need anything clarifying. Thanks for listening.